Today, this is the third lecture in the series, and in continuation to this series on kinship studies, today I will basically talk about approaches to study of kinship. And this lecture can be considered in terms of two major approaches that we can be doing today. First is the descent approach to study of kinship, and in the later half of my lecture, I will be talking about the alliance approach to study kinship. Now, these approaches are very important in the study of kinship because they provide us a different perspective to the study of how we look into understanding relations in terms of how structures of the society are maintained, and also help us to understand that kinship will not only in itself can be understood in terms of a family relation, but also in terms of having a implication on understanding economy and political system as well. So, with this, let us begin today's lecture on the first approach, that is the descent approach to study of kinship. And if we kind of understand that if we go back to the first two lecture and let kind of a rewind or recap, we can read that in the first lecture we were talking about the whole significance of kinship study, and in the second lecture I have talked about the basic terms and concept in kinship study. So, to remember that kinship is generally a system of recognizing relationship by blood and social relations. This kind of an understanding goes back to the beginning of kinship relations, where it was considered that in order to understand what kinship was, we could understand it through basically in the initial it was two-way, that is either a relation is blood based or it is kind of a marital based, and two very relevant terms were used to understand, that is consanguineal and affinal. Consanguineal were all relations which were blood related to blood, and affinal were people who were related through marriage. And based on these two concepts, we see two important approaches came, and that is one approach which is also known as the descent approach, or we can also be kind of call it as consanguineal approach. Many people refer it to as biological model in the study of kinship, in which the focus is on blood relation, the focus is on genealogy, the focus is on terms of classification and kinship terminology. And therefore, after say like 1930s to 1940s, this approach was very dominant, and there was a large number of anthropologists who were all trying to understand kinship relation in different parts of the world, with the focus on understanding kinship through blood relation. With the later, there was like of a critique of the understanding of relations based solely on blood, and these are the people who came up with a second approach to study of kinship, and that was called alliance or an affinal approach. The alliance approach focuses on the formation of group solidarity based on marriage. And here we will see in the second half of the lecture, basically coming in from Levi-Strauss to kind of understanding alliance as exchange of women, which would lead to the structuring of society. After 1960s, there was a kind of a gap in the study of kinship, and people thought that there was nothing left to study kinship. What about kinship? And therein comes in the picture David Schneider, who had studied the cultural kinship system in America, and he gives us the approach termed as cultural approach, where he will talk about kinship as cultural or kinship as symbolic, and therefore kind of a critique of the earlier approaches, which is considered to be kind of approach which was creating model, or which were kind of creating models but could not be applied. So from an approach which was kind of arriving at a universal generalized understanding of kinship, to an approach which kind of argued that kinship is culturally specific, and in the sense that David Schneider would argue that kinship is abstract, it is something which can be only understood with a symbolic meaning. So, there is kind of an flow, and if you see kind of an evolutionary development in the study of kinship, which kind goes from the study of blood and consanguineal relations to study of marriage, then to the study of culture. And then in the 1980s towards 1990s, we see that lot of new approach to kinship comes in, with the feminist argument coming in, where they're trying to understand that it is kind of a relation of relatedness, where one can be kind of evolve a relation which is beyond marriage, which is beyond biology, and these are the new kinship studies which will bring in the understanding of homosexual family, will bring in the understanding of new reproductive technology which has kind of changed the biological meaning of motherhood and maternity. So this is kind of a brief looking at how are the approaches which we understand in kinship. Today the focus is just going to be on the descent approach and the alliance approach. In the coming lectures I will be talking about cultural approach and the new studies in kinship. So let us look into what is descent approach. We kind of try to understand that there are large number of anthropologists who were kind of contributing to the understanding of kinship through biological model. And to name some of them, here we begin with Lewis Henry Morgan, whose work was system of consanguinity and affinity. This was one of the major work which kind of brought in this understanding of kinship from a biological perspective. Another important anthropologist who kind of lays down the ground for understanding kinship through descent is Ratcliffe Brown, and his important work is African System of Kinship and Marriage. The third anthropologist who have kind of given us a new perspective to biological model of kinship is Mayor Fortes in his work Time and Social Structure and other essay. And another anthropologist who is equally of significance is Evans Pritchard. Now all of them were kind of doing a field based anthropological work in different areas. So Evans Pritchard has studied the newer tribe of Africa. Mayor Fortes have studied the Talan Sea, and Ratcliffe Brown has also kind of based his studies in the African society. So if we look into what was a kind of a focus of the descent approach, we see that the focus is on tracing the genealogical origin by blood relation in terms of descent. So the focus is here to try to understand how are two persons related to one another, and the argument was that it is related through a bloodline, and therefore the descent was considered as a concept which could be considered as helping organize the society in terms of tracing blood. So you had your ancestor, and then you have father, his son and the grandson. They were all related to each other through the line of blood. Therefore, the focus of the biological model is on understanding descent. Descent becomes very important. Descent is a principle of organizing group, and therefore it's also kinship terminology. Kinship terminology was kind of used terms which was used for address or reference, which kind of was kind of based on the principle of unity of sibling group, based on the unity of lineage, based on the unity of alternate generation. So terminology reflected the kinship social structure of the society, and in that context it became very significant. We will see also Mayor Fortes uses the term complementary filiation. So filiation is a concept to descent was used to understand relations which was kind of not only through people who were related through blood, but also people who were kind of other side. So there was a kind of an opposition between consanguinity and affinity. So consanguinal relations were relations which was through blood based, and then the opposite kind of a relation was the relation through your a final relation. So for example, if a society was a patrilineal society, father, father's brother, father's father were all consanguinal relative, and at the same time those in the related through mother, that is mother's brother, mother's sister, they were considered as a final relation. And if we look into the descent approach, they kind of creates a kind of a hierarchy where in a patrilineal descent the patrilineal side of relations were considered to be primary, and the mother side of relations were considered as secondary. And in that context, there was a kind of an understanding that in a patrilineal society, the father side's relation was formal, and therefore we had a formal ego or the point of reference had a formal relation with his father, whereas the relation with the mother's brother was kind of informal or kind of a joking relation. So a very clear kind opposition was constructed between consanguinity and affinity. In this approach, we see that they kind of also try to understand, because this was a time when for the first time anthropologists were studying society. There was a kind of perspective which was trying to compare simple society to complex society. And according to this, the simple kinship was considered to be a principle of organization of simple society. So a person's place in the society was determined by his position with kinship system. This was an argument which came up because the anthropologists were trying to understand societies in which there were no formal political system, and therefore kinship was the only system through which order could be brought back in the society. And therefore, the line of filiation, which was kind of an attachment to the other side of relations who were not related to descent, became significant. And in the previous lecture, to recall, we have talked about the types of descent, and therefore the descent was kind of understood in terms of a classificatory by different anthropologists. One of the most standard classification of descent was in terms of understanding types of descent as unilineal, double, cognatic. And therefore, we see the unilineal, there is only a single line of descent, with either it is a patrilineal line of descent, which is line through the father, or it is a matrilineal line of descent, that is the recognition of the line of mother's relatives. So, the society was organized either on the principle of unilineal or on the double descent or on cognatic principle, and therefore, the argument of the biological approach was that descent is the main principle of organizing society. Now, when we look into the non-Western society, which is considered to be the more simple society, the emphasis was on particular line of descent whose analysis was believed to unpack the social mechanism and account for the maintenance and reproduction of social order. So, the entire order or the structure of the society was actually dependent on how people recognize their kin relation and how what kind of a significance was given to these relation. So, one of the classical studies of talency, which is the study done by Mayer Fortes, or we see another case study which is Evans Pritchard the newer, the modalities of kinship organization and functioning of descent as structuring principle were present as central to understanding the society, their boundaries and the internal equilibrium. When I go into the specific anthropologist, we see how each one of them, whether it be Mayer Fortes, newer, they are kind of trying to focus on the ways in which the kinship relations became critical to political and economic organization of the society. Each society was seen as characterized by an emphasis on certain genealogical link and thus disregard for other. So, in a matrilineal society, a father's position was generally perceived as marginal. So, when we actually try to read Radcliffe Brown, we will see that he is kind of considering mother's brother's role very significant in a matrilineal society, because the brother is the male figure is kind of directly related to the female whose line of inheritance is considered as significant, whereas in a patrilineal society the mother's brother's role become insignificant. So, this kind of a contrast between father's role and the mother's brother's role was kind of contrasted in order to understand how society is been organized on the lines of descent. A mother and her relative, in a particular the mother's brother, was seen as center of child's social life and largely determined his or her future prospect. And herein only we can try to understand the concept of matrilineal puzzle becomes very significant, because the argument is that if the line of descent is the principle of organizing society and a single line of is being followed, so in a patrilineal society, the line of inheritance and the line of acquiring power is through the male line. So, kind of a patrilineal society, we get a patriarchal society. But when it was kind of contrasted, the patrilineal society was contrasted to a matrilineal society, the biological approach argued that in a matrilineal society, the line of inheritance was through female, but the power was passing from a female to the male, that is mother's brother or sister's son. And this was kind of puzzle that has been termed as matrilineal puzzle, whereby one could understand that the power was always retained by a male member, and therefore there was an understanding that matriarchal society kind of becomes a utopia or something which does not actually exist. So this understanding of matrilineal puzzle is actually the result of trying to contrast two set of society following different principle of unilineal descent. So now we go into the main anthropologist and try to understand the argument that they have done in order to make us understand kinship through blood relation. So the first anthropologist that is of most significance is Lewis Morgan, and he, along with Henry Maine, Asian Society, these are considered as a stepping stone in the history of anthropological kinship studies. That is, these are the first studies which kind of throw light on the how we are going to understand kinship as the principle of organizing society. So Morgan provided an evolutionary thinking. Evolutionary thinking was kind of critical at that point in British anthropologists, whereby society was seen as evolving from a simple society to a complex society, and kinship was kind of a demarker between a simple society and a complex society. And in a simple society, kinship was seen as a system that regulated economy and politics, whereas in a complex society, what was done by kinship or the function of kinship was replaced by state and political institution. Therefore, he kind of understands that as we evolve from a simple society to a complex society, the role of kinship in organizing social relations becomes different. Kinship was presented as an epicenter of the so-called primitive society's social organization. So, in order to understand that how could a society which does not have a political order still be have a kind of a structure, it was kind of located within the kinship relation. According to Morgan, kinship was a principle for differentiating simple society from complex modern society. Primitive society was seen as societies based on blood, and a view that dominated anthropology till a very long time, till 1970s. Kinship gave the explanation of the problem of maintenance of social order in the absence of state-based organization. So, this kind of an understanding kind of reflects on the role of kinship. So, if there was no kind of a political institutions where kind of people were elected, there was a kind of a hereditary selection of a leader, which was kind of understood through blood relations. The second anthropologist is Radcliffe Brown. Radcliffe Brown kind of is a structural functionalist. He is trying to understand the role that kinship plays in maintaining the structures of the society. So, for him, kinship systems are classified according to descent. So, I have already said that for Radcliffe Brown, it was very significant to understand the descent principle as kind of differentiating between a patrilineal society and a matrilineal society. Two particular distinctive forms are patrilineal descent reckoned through males only and matrilineal descent reckoned through females only. Radcliffe Brown insisted on the study of a kinship system as a field of rights and obligations. So, he is not just restricting it in terms of kind of understanding the relations that are based on blood, but he is trying to kind of provide us a kind of a legal understanding of kinship, which says that the function of kinship is to kind of express the rights and obligations of each individual towards the other. And in this kind of understanding of rights and obligation, what actually happens is that we kind of have a structure which can be well explanatory. Kinship systems should be regarded as a special social relations that form part of broader general network of social relations called social structure. So, the structure part of the society was the most significant focus on which Radcliffe Brown had concentrated. And for Radcliffe Brown, who is kind of focusing on descent as a principle of understanding kinship relations, for him, descent was both social and biological. So, it's not that he was just focusing on the physiological aspect of blood relation, but what as an anthropologist, his focus was on kind of understanding the social meaning of descent. And in this regard, he differentiated between the pater, which is a social father, and a genitor, which is a biological father. So it can be found in many studies in the African society that the pater and the genitor may not coincide. So there could be, so for instance, among the Nair, the pater or the social father was the person who would kind of give certain gifts to the women at the time of her delivery of the child, and that child was recognized as a legitimate offspring of that person who was the pater, and could be different from the biological father because of the institution of sambandha which was prevalent among the Nair society. Right in he is also focusing on rights and kind of obligations, and in this context he makes a distinction between rights in personam and rights in rem. So he says certain rights that a husband has to his wife, by virtue of these rights he may reacquire the execution of her respective duties. So the domestic tasks that women are doing was seen as a kind of a right that the husband had over the wife. If in relation to his wife someone commits a violent action, the mechanism will take effect right in rem. The offence will be treated as a crime against her husband. So these kind of the kind of an understanding of the rights that individuals share in society became significant for understanding kinship relation. The third most important anthropologist to have contributed to the understanding of biological model is Evans Pritchard. Evans Pritchard's study of the Nuer is a classical text in the anthropology. He studied the tribes of southern Sudan to focus on kinship group, particularly group based on descent in male line. So the Nuer are a patrilineal nomadic group, and it's obviously kind of a primitive society in which there is no kind of a political institution to regulate. And Evans Pritchard's work will tell us that even in society which does not have kind of a formal institutions for maintaining regulation, kinship function to provide a kind of an order in society. He shows us how genes functioned as political group in Nuer society. He emphasized on the recruitment, perpetuation and functioning of groups in Africa. So when, as I told you, that he is talking about the kind of nomadic society which is a cattle based society, and he calls this as the bovine idiom, which is the idiom kind of the relation that the cattle have with the Nuer people is kind of a complementary relation, and one cannot exist without the other. So Nuers kind of the entire life of the Nuers were based on the migratory pattern of the environment, and it was regulated through scarcity of water, vegetation and abundance of insect. What is most significant in the study of Nuer society is that ordered anarchy, which I already said is a society where there is no political state. It is a stateless society, yet there is an order, and therefore it is termed as ordered anarchy because order existed on the basis of remarkable variant among the people. And another concept which Evans Pritchard gives us is segmentary lineage, how the kinship society was segmented, yet there was a relation between each segment, and all the segment together provided the total whole. So the relative relation between the segment and how they kind of established the relation between two segments was actually the basis of political unity, and the process of fusion and fission kind of led into the understanding of tendency to either come close to the segment or break up from the segment, and that kind of fission and fusion actually helped in maintaining order. Another concept which Nuer gives us is age set system, which each society, as say from the 10 years onwards, were divided into age, and these age set system was ritually recognized as a transition from childhood to manhood, and each set had a kind of political obligation towards the state. The fourth most important anthropologist is Mayor Fortis, and as I've already said, he gives us the concept of filiation and descent. Filiation, he says, is the emotion that we attached with the other side of the relation, and therefore he gives us the concept of complementary filiation. So in a patrilineal society, we have matrifiliation, that is the attachment that we have with our mother's relative, and in a matrilineal society, we have patrifiliation, which is a filiation which we have with our father's relative. So this is the concept which he calls as complementary filiation, and he also tells us that there is a kind of a filiation is always bilateral and descent is unilateral. So we kind of if we look into the study of all these anthropologists, we kind to understand how through descent they were trying to understand the relations which was established between members of the society. So with going through all these anthropologists, Truckley Brown, Mayor Fortis, Evans Pritchard, we get an idea of what the anthropologists were kind of doing in the beginning or in the starting of the understanding of kinship through an approach which was considered as a descent approach. With this, I come to an end to the first part of my lecture.